And joining us now to debate defining Canadian citizenship, Debbie Douglas, Executive Director of OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Richard Gwynn, author of John A., The Man Who Made Us. Francisco Rico Martinez, co-director of the FCJ Refugee Center. Avi Go, director at the Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. And Antoinette Gagné, professor at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Good to have everybody around the table today to continue our discussion on the new Citizenship Guide. And just before we start talking about that, it happens that 4 of you were not born in this country. And I would actually like to start by just asking you, when you first came to Canada, what did you have to learn in order to become a citizen? Start us, if you would.
Well, I went to elementary school here, and when I wrote the citizenship test in my early 20s, it really felt like a grade 10 history lesson. So I had to understand the political system, the relationship between the provinces and the feds, how many provinces existed in Canada and the territories.
All good stuff to know.
All good stuff to know, but it really didn't speak to what citizenship should really mean as a Canadian. It really didn't speak to what it is our relationship with each other should be.
So we're going to talk about that more tonight. You came from where originally?
I come from Grenada in the Caribbean.
From Grenada. Okay. Richard Gwynn, you come from where originally? Like, I don't know.
England.
Yes, you do.
You'd never guess that, I know.
And do you remember what you had to know when
I
you
do.
came
It's
here?
very easy to remember. 0. I have to admit, I needed to become a citizen, which was 67, to know nothing about Canada. I actually did because I was a political journalist. But looking back, it is strange. Now, I don't think it was biased because I was English. I think that was the system then. It was Expo here which decided me that to become a Canadian.
Did you think that was wrong, that you didn't have to know anything?
No, I don't think I did. I mean, I'm being honest, which is a very risky thing to be. I think I just sort of took it for granted because I was English, to be as honest as one could possibly be.
Okay. Francisco, where did you come from?
El Salvador.
And what did you need to know?
Well, at that particular moment, nothing, because I had been living in Canada for 5 years. I knew a lot about Canada, and I was very depressed when I went to read this guide for citizenship that I received at that time, that didn't teach me anything new. So I was saying, well, what's going on here, you know? And I understood immediately why everybody passed the exam. You know, it's 96 or 97% of passing, and
Because it was too easy.
I think so. And you know, and even the questions that you have in the exam, they give you the answer. So you have to put just 2 things together and do it. Okay. So in my opinion, I didn't need to know anything else.
Gotcha. Avi, where did we get you from?
Well, I came from Hong Kong, and then when I first came here, I went straight to university. So I was at University of Waterloo, and I remember the test at that time was an oral test. You went in to see the citizenship judge, and I think it was like questions about, like, you know, provinces or whatever. The only question I remember was who was the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, and it was Lincoln Alexander at the time, so you know how long it was ago, and I could not remember his name. That's the only thing I remember.
How come you're a citizen?
How did you pass?
Did you write the black guy?
Yeah, the black guy that I've seen on TV.
That's not good enough.
No, you know, Lincoln Alexander was the answer to many questions. You know. First black cabinet minister, first black lieutenant governor. Anyway, he was, and is still with us today, and a fabulous Hamiltonian, if I may say.
And I got to meet him after, you know, yeah.
Did you tell him? Did you fess up that you didn't know who he was? You did.
Yes.
Okay. Antoinette, I'm tempted to ask you a similar question because although you didn't come here from another country, you did move to Ontario from Quebec. Those are I mean, let's tell it like it is. That's a different experience moving from Quebec to Ontario. Did you have a similar experience as these 4?
Probably not as drastic of a change experience, but certainly moving from a francophone world where I went to school and worked in French, I felt like I did need a course in intercultural communication. I wasn't used to the kind of diversity that there was in Ontario. A lot of the ways that I communicated weren't valued here. I had a sharp, sarcastic sense as a teacher and as an educator, and that certainly wasn't valued in the Ontario college and university context.
Sure.
So I found it difficult to acculturate.
Is French your first language?
Both French and English.
I was going to say, you have absolutely zero accent, but you spoke French at home.
Yep, and English.
And English, okay,
Yep.
both at home, okay. All right, well, let's get into this new guide that we just heard Jason Kenney telling us about. And Debbie, again, to you first. General impressions, what do you think?
Think it was long overdue. Reads more like a civic lesson, which is what I think we need. I think it's a step in the right direction. I still think there's lots of room for improvement in terms of what it is that the guide tends to glide over.
Like what?
For example, the existence of slavery in Canada. It talks about Upper Canada being one of the first British provinces to abolish slavery, but never acknowledges, for example, that slavery really did exist in Canada. It ties the fact that Jews who were trying to get into Canada as refugees during the Hitler years were turned away, and that's tied to the Depression as opposed to what was happening and the Canada's politics at the time. So there are places where we can really, I think,
Richard,
make differences.
Let me go to you on that. I mean, they're getting some credit right now for not glossing over a lot of the less elegant parts of our history, but it sounds like, from Debbie's point of view, they should have gone farther. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a remarkable document because it is the first time, and what people have been saying earlier confirms this, that the government has tried to sketch out to a newcomer the nature of the country that they've just joined or will soon become a citizen of. And that's a very tough thing to do given we're so diverse and all those things. And everybody, it's the nature of Canada, can legitimately say, of whatever gets written, that isn't good enough, it doesn't highlight my problems, my grievances, and so on, and all of this is valid. But nevertheless, I think this is a remarkably honest and honorable effort. And this is shown by the fact that it's had a lot of praise, but much more remarkably, it's had very little criticism.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I've hardly noticed a letter to the editor enraged, but in the nature of Canada is you could hardly say good morning without 6 people jumping up and saying you haven't said good morning to me. You know, that's the way we are.
Well, and we should, I guess, stress the fact that while we have many different parts of the world and our country's multicultural fabric represented here today, the fact is we can't represent everybody, and you're all speaking for yourselves and not the respective communities you come from and so on. But if you want some criticism, here we go. You ready? Francisco. What did you think? What did you think about the... there's a new emphasis on Canada's not peacekeeping history, but military history in this document. What did you think of that?
I was shocked about that because why people choose to come to Canada is because this is a peaceful society. That's the attraction. The pole of attraction is because it's peaceful, because the interventions that internationally Canada has had in different conflicts, you know, the way that we are acting. So you feel even proud, even don't be Canadian at that particular time, for the different roles that Canada had played in the world.
Is it not important for you to know that this country participated in D-Day, in Vimy, these kinds of...
So the Minister Kenney believed that I learned that Canada participated in the Second World War because I read the book. I already know this. Okay. So I think the issue is not what I know and what I don't know. The issue is what do I need to know to become a Canadian citizen? And in order to do that, in my opinion, he has to come and talk to the refugees and immigrant communities. And he has to ask the direct question. And to the native people, and ask them to put together something that reflects, according to their values, what is the piece of history that they want to show. They have to ask that questions, in my opinion, and that haven't been asked. So it's another book.
I want to ask the guy who, I don't know if you graduated, but you attended a military college in the UK, Sandringham?
Sandhurst.
Sandhurst, excuse me. What do you think of that comment?
Well, on the military one, I think there is a hidden agenda here, which is, I mean, to honor our military men, those who actually sacrifice for the country, is totally valid. And we didn't do that for a long time. We just ignored them for about 20 years. You know, they would, because, and so what's happened, the change is very valid. But I think there is a small hidden agenda, it's human. Stephen Harper loves military history. If you're a cabinet minister trying to get something through the cabinet, you stuff in a lot of military history, and Stephen Harper will sign off quickly. I think that's part of what's happened. There is more military history in this than you really need. It is terribly important to us.
Yeah.
VME was the start of Canadian consciousness. Before that, we were just British living in North America, leaving aside Francophones, but British living in North America. VME in World War I was enormously important. The War of 1812, when we drew a war with the United States. This is enormously important to Canadian consciousness. You may know this, but a lot of people don't.
Avi, what do you think about the inclusion of so much military history this time?
Well, I think that for the same reason, I think a lot of people like it is because it's not as sanitized as the previous one. And, you know, for that reason, I think, you know, talking about the military history is important because in a way, as Francisco said, many people think of Canada as a peacekeeping country. And, you know, I think they should learn about that has not always been the case. The same reason why, you know, we need to talk about the, you know, some of the historical wrongs. But what I find interesting, though, you know, when they talk about the historical wrongs, such as the Japanese internment and the Chinese head tax issue, they use the word, for instance, in the case of Japanese internment, they use the word relocation as opposed to internment. When they talk about Chinese head tax, they exclude, they didn't talk about the Exclusion Act, which is actually a far more discriminatory piece of legislation than the head tax. So I just find that very interesting how they selectively. Yeah, I mean, it's like if they're going to go all the way, just go all the way. Like, you know, be open and frank about, you know, all these things. And we're not talking about, you know, adding more paragraphs, like, you know, just changing one word or adding two words here and there. So.
Antoinette, can I get your view on whether some of it is still too sanitized, even though it's blunter than in the past?
I guess I'm thinking of it from a different perspective rather than is it sanitized enough or too much? It's really in terms of the language used and the level of difficulty. So when I compare the previous publication from 2005 with this current one, I see that the level of language is much more sophisticated, which is great, but it's still attempting to pull away some of the details so that we only have sort of the essence. So what concerns me is that a lot of things seem to be simplified and essentialized. So I found as I was reading that it was a whole new take on my understanding of what we had done in different decades and different centuries of Canada.
That's worth mentioning because Jason Kenney mentioned a few times, I think, in the interview, this is not just for new Canadians. This is for people who've been here, you know, quote unquote, since the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock, if I can find a Canadian analogy, which I can't.
Plymouth Rock, you've been outside.
I know what I'm trying to say. Been here for a few hundred years. It's important, because I think his point was there's lots of people who've been here a long time who don't know anything about this stuff as well. Debbie, let me pick up on something here. I want to put this quote to you. This is right out of the document itself about our founding peoples. To understand what it means to be Canadian, it is important to know about our three founding peoples, Aboriginal, French, and British. Canadian society today stems largely from the English-speaking and French-speaking Christian civilizations that were brought here from Europe by settlers. Again, an emphasis on this that wasn't there in the original, or I should say in the previous document. What do you think of that?
I think finally we're speaking about Aboriginal peoples as founding people of this place we call Canada. But it's interesting how we then quickly fall back into this whole notion that Canadianism means whiteness and it means Christianity. In terms of moving forward, because when we talk about a civics document, it has to be forward-looking. And I agree with my colleagues around the table. I think our history is important. I think that we all need to know about our history. That's why I liked the document, because I think it's not only for new Canadians, but it's also for older Canadians who've been here for generations, black, white, Aboriginal,
but do you
or
feel,
other.
When you read that, do you feel
But when I
excluded?
read that, I think what it does is that it negates the importance that First Nations and Métis and Inuit have played in this country.
Richard, can you comment on that? You agree that it somehow marginalizes those who aren't from those three founding groups?
Well, I mean, the one founding group is included with the one you're talking about. I mean, the Inuit and Native people. Those are one of the three founding. They're described it the first time as one of the three founding.
They're described in one
They were not
sentence.
marginalized in this document.
But in that paragraph, they have been marginalized, because we quickly talk about the three founding peoples, we include Aboriginals, and then the next sentence talks about that it was largely founded by British and French Christians.
Let's keep in mind.
Well,
there's
that
an
is a historical fact.
Let's just keep in mind as well. In the quote, there's an ellipsis there. We didn't throw the whole quote out there, so there's a few things missing. But essentially, that's
Yeah, I mean, isn't it? I mean, the word is founded. It was founded by those who created modern Canada were primarily English and French, and they were overwhelmingly Christian. That is a historical fact. I don't see why you want to change that.
I wouldn't want to change it, but what I'm concerned about is that once again, while I am very pleased that we're finally talking about the role that Aboriginal communities played historically in this place that we now call Canada, that we go back to this habit that we have of the two founding peoples.
French, English, and all white.
French, English, and all
Francisco, what do
white.
you say on that?
Well, you know, they conquered this place, though. They invade this place. They destroy the culture of other people here. And there is no possible to just say, they are the three peoples that found this country. Because one of them is still living in serious poverty, discrimination. So, and they are denying the question that you asked to the Minister of Immigration about what is the situation of the native people right now. So they say, well, we are not going to put all the negative stuff in the whole thing. So in my opinion, just to go in that direction is if you go to any country that have been conquered by Europeans and you call the native people there, oh, you found this with us, when you know that the churches have been built over the temples of the native people. So that's a very scary way of saying it, in my opinion. And the last thing that I would like to say is that also discriminate against the other people that are founders of this country that came along later. You know what I mean? For instance, the Chinese community. For me, they are the real founders of this country. They did the unification with their hands. They built the road, you know, they built the train. What is the recognition of that? And the exclusions that we do against them and any other communities? In my opinion, this is a very, I dislike this way because I come from a country that have been colonized by Europeans and destroyed by Europeans.
Let me put some of the, I think what most people have observed as some of the harshest language in the document on the table and get you to comment on that. Avi, I'll put this question to you first, and once again, let's read the quote from Discover Canada. In Canada, men and women are equal under the law. Canada's openness and generosity do not extend to barbaric cultural practices that tolerate spousal abuse, honor killings, female genital mutilation, and other gender-based violence. Avi, was it important to put that in the book?
Well, I think there are two parts to it. That paragraph appears in the chapter where they talk about the Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. My first reaction was when I read that particular section is they talk about a number of things, including equality right, but the only equality right they highlight was gender equality. And for a lot of the newcomers, given the reality is that most of them are now from Asia, as the guy acknowledged, I think more important for them is to understand that there is also equality based on race and national origin, which is not mentioned in there. And having said that, I think what I find troubling in that particular paragraph is that it equates spousal abuse, equates violence against women to cultural practices.
That's right.
And I think that gives an impression that only certain people who practice certain cultures are bringing into Canada the issue of gender inequality. But of course, in reality, spousal abuse, domestic violence, as you said, happens on a day-to-day basis. We have women who are killed in Canada as well.
You would not have put it as a part of that
list? No,
then.
and I think it's one of those statements where, and this is the only paragraph in the entire document where they are almost like the tone was almost punitive or almost sort of like we're teaching you something or we're preaching
admonishing.
Admonishing, yeah, and that's the only one. You don't find any other paragraphs in that sort of that nature in the entire
Antoinette,
document.
let me get your view on that.
To help get a sense of what other people were thinking, I actually spoke to several people at work today and asked them how they felt about that term, and I read the quote to them, and they shared your views that the the use of the word barbaric felt very inappropriate in a document of this kind. And because it was positioned at the very top of a page and the top of a new section, it really felt like it was standing out for all the wrong reasons. So.
Richard, they are saying, though, and the minister did say, we're serious about this. Multiculturalism doesn't mean that you can bring practices that are completely antithetical to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms over this country and think that it's okay. Do you need to say that in this document?
I wonder about that. I mean, the practices are barbaric, disgusting, debasing, you know, the practices that are described there. And why should one not have the courage to say so? Why are you all resisting that statement? You're all finding reasons to resist it, but in different ways you're all resisting it. These are appalling acts. And surely if this document reduces the frequency in this country of Canadian women being brutalized and cut up, that is a plus.
Violence against women is a barbaric act. Femicide of whether or not you're white, whether or not you're Asian, whether or not you're African, whether or not you're Muslim or Christian, whether or not, it doesn't matter. The issue is violence against women. That is what our values are in Canada. That is what the document should speak about. This is written as if newcomers to Canada are the ones who are bringing in these practices, as if these practices have not always...
Those particular practices are not indigenous to Canada.
No, spousal abuse is indigenous.
No, I said those
spousal abuse. It's spousal abuse.
One at a time. He's referring to the last
spousal
few.
abuse.
I'm talking about what they
He's
wrote.
talking about female genital mutilation.
That is not a Canadian practice ever.
Yes, but killing women is a Canadian practice.
It is happening now. And surely you should be resisting it instead of finding subtle intellectual reasons.
No, I think you're misunderstanding. I think you're misunderstanding.
That's the effect.
Not at all. The fact that the document even speaks to issues of gender and gender violence is very welcome. It is the language that was used, and I think both of my colleagues spoke in terms of, you know, words like barbaric. You know, and
but if it is, shouldn't you say it is?
Yes, but so is killing women. Whether or not it's FGM, whether or not it's honor killing, whether or not it's a husband who thinks he owns his wife and slaughters her, they're all barbaric.
Francisco wanted a word on this.
My opinion is then we have to do a section when we talk about these specific human rights violations. You know, then we as a country, as a state, we said no to them. And we have to list all of them because torture, for instance, is a serious crime. You know, and I believe that has to be mentioned there in a very precise way. Discrimination, racism, you have to list all of poverty, children, poverty of children,
sexual exploitation,
trafficking, whatever. So we have to have a list. Of course we have. But not in that particular way, because this one believe that is put it in a part that doesn't belong, in my opinion, and create that impression that could be someone that is criticizing that part is denying that part, which is not true.
No.
So that has to be put it in a very clear perspective.
Antoinette,
Absolutely.
once again, please.
I'm concerned that many of the issues that we've been talking about are have been raised because of the nature of the document. So the document's only about 50 pages long, and we're trying to take a multi-year history that's multifaceted and complex, and we're trying to, you know, put it into this number of pages and to have it be attractive and accessible with language. So it's really a problem with the nature of the document, and this is just one example.
Exactly.
But I think every one of the issues that's been raised by Steve so far calls to the need to elaborate and provide different shades and nuances, which in a short document is very difficult to do. I think it's a much improved document compared to before, and it does a lot of great things, but it doesn't have the kind of nuances. As somebody who's educated and who's read a lot, I can read between the lines and fill in the stuff, but I was trying to put on my educator hat and be a new Canadian for whom English is an additional language, and even trying to understand the content with an additional language sort of perspective, and then try to make sense of what's packed into each paragraph. Each paragraph is representing thousands of pages of history and research.
For sure. Richard, you want to...
Well, I just wanted to say this. I mean, the danger is, it's the old danger of the perfect being the enemy of the good. And we could sit around for months and years and not the 6 of us, let alone 35 million Canadians, agree on a document that could ever be published. This is a damn good effort, and I'm amazed that it's come out, because there was nothing before it. There was Pablo. The previous document was ridiculous. It told newcomers to turn off the lights, you know, when they weren't using them in a room. I mean, this is childish. This was treating newcomers like children. It was an insult to them. And this is an adult document. It has flaws. I could cite several flaws. But my basic argument is we should take it and run with it. You can then argue about it and pressure MPs, and there may be eventually a better document. But don't kill it by over-analysis.
Not at all.
There is no possible to kill it anyway. It's printed.
Well, it is a done
it's going
deal.
to be distributed. So there's nothing that we can do about it. We didn't.
And there really are ways of working with it as a starting point. I mean, many new Canadians take citizenship courses, and there's lots of opportunities during these courses to look at those nuances and those shades and make sense of it and have great discussions. So I don't think it's lost.
I want to revisit an issue that we touched on briefly a little while ago, and we'll spend a little more time on it right now, and that is on the issue of our past and some of the less glorious moments in it. We call this graphic historic discrimination. British Columbia joined Canada in 1871 after Ottawa promised to build a railway to the west coast. The project was financed by British and American investors and built by both European and Chinese labor. Afterwards, the Chinese were subject to discrimination, including the head tax, a race-based entry fee. The Government of Canada apologized in 2006 for this discriminatory policy. There was also mention in the document about residential schools crisis and about how the government has also apologized for that as well. And I guess I want to get some better understanding here. Avi, to you first. How well does the new guide deal with our failings and as well as our strengths?
I think in terms of failing, I think it's sort of, it tried to sanitize it a little bit too much. And I think I find it interesting because the Harper government actually could take credit for apologizing to the Chinese for the head tax and the exclusion
and
act.
The residential school.
And the residential school. So I think they could afford to use stronger language in both the residential school issue as well as the Chinese head tax. I mentioned my concern about the Chinese head tax. On the residential school issue, they mention physical abuse but not sexual abuse. They talk about it as an underfunding issue without talking about the whole, I guess, you know, sort of attempt to civilize, you know, Aboriginal children. So I just don't understand, you know, the rationale behind the sanitization on those particular issues.
Richard, we saw earlier from just a few moments ago, this document doesn't shy away from using harsh language when it feels it's necessary to. But this is not as harsh, I guess, as some people would like it to be. Are they being overly sensitive, do you think? Perhaps they are.
Perhaps they are. I think that's the point. We, as a people, should not be afraid to apologize for mistakes. Except in one sense, I find it, a certain thing worries me, that we tend to apologize for something that happened 100 years ago, 150 years ago, you know, slavery or whatever it may be. And we therefore think we're such wonderful guys today. I mean, Francisco has made this point. Others have. Our record with Native people is an abomination. Yes. Well, you could go into the reasons why we fail so badly. And they're not as straightforward as just throwing money by any means. But there is a tendency for us to assume that back 100 years ago, all Canadians were racists, sexists, homophobic, and all anti-Semitic, which they were, because the whole world was then, and that we are wonderful. That is the implication. And I don't like that. And I think it would be good if we stopped apologizing and looked at ourselves.
Debbie, what do you say?
I say that we acknowledge where we've gone wrong, and we show, because I think it shows what part of our values are. That
Is the language strong enough?
No, I don't think the language is strong enough, and it goes back to what you were speaking about in terms of how do you fit context into all of that. But it also goes back to my earlier point that why, when you speak about the gender issue, your language is so strong, but when you speak about the state's mistakes, that your language, you soften the language.
Okay, would you acknowledge that the language here is at least a good deal tougher than anything you've seen
Oh,
previously?
absolutely. The fact that it's being
So they've gone some distance.
Yes.
Francisco, what do you say on that issue of whether or not the history of the country has been too sanitized?
I think so. And it's sanitized every day. That's the problem, no? Then we continue sanitizing in the public life than we do every second day here.
Like what?
Deportations to torture, the implications of situations in Afghanistan, wherever. The way that the government is talking is very sanitized, and that's my really concern. It's not this book that is going to be read and pass an exam, and you know what I mean? And if you ask an exam maybe 2 months later on what they learn about this, maybe they're going to forget 50% of what they read, and it's not going to be a building of the Canadian citizenship through this book. But my problem is the style and the dynamic that is creating the sanitization, the hiding of things that we don't want to make public. Yeah. You know, and this is a very problematic approach, and in my opinion, that goes against the value of Canadians of compromising. You know what I mean? Compromising has been something that you learn here as soon as you come. You have to compromise. You have to understand. Maybe this one is also in that way when they are saying, well, you have to understand anyway.
Antoinette, what's your view on this?
I'm of the opinion that it's important that those elements were there, but I really do think it's like all the other issues that they're just covered in a superficial way, and that we do need to go into greater depth. My biggest concern is that this document be worked with well, that it not just remain a document in isolation, and the government take some responsibility to scaffold the experience, not just for new Canadians, but for all Canadians.
Okay. One of the things we like to do on this program is we don't want to take a kind of cynical, capital P political look at everything that happens in the country. So we've spent 95% of our time here talking about the policy itself, the book itself, on the merits. We're going to save a few minutes here at the end to talk about capital P politics and ask whether the Conservative government, which as we all know has been just a dozen seats or so shy of a majority government and is close, and whether this helps get them closer because it helps recraft Canada in a big C conservative way, which is what some people allege is what's going on. Brother Gwyn, what do you say?
Well, Brother Gwyn doesn't work for it because I'm retired now, but I still write for a liberal newspaper named the Toronto Star, and I've been praising or defending this document, and it's been attacked by immigrants. Three of them, you know. Well, yeah, but you've had a lot of criticism and so on, hasn't gone far enough, hasn't satisfied you. And I think, on the whole, I think it's a damn good document, and you know,
therefore,
don't nibble it to death like ducks.
But does that help the Conservative Party politically?
Of course it helps the Conservative Party. Of course this is a political document in part, but I mean, in Ottawa you breathe politics.
Right, fair enough. Francisco, does this help big C Conservatives?
For sure.
It does, eh?
It does, and it does because it does in the same way that some trips are put together for the Prime Minister to particular countries, and the way that have been presented by the media, and the way that... So this is the Minister of Immigration being in the media every single week, finding something to do and finding something to say.
Okay, Debbie, let me go further.
Of course it does.
Is this all about the Conservative Party's efforts to reach out to more multicultural communities and get those votes, which traditionally have not been theirs in the past?
I think it helps.
But it's not all about that.
I am not that cynical. So I do think that this is a step in the right direction, as I said, but absolutely it helps the Conservative Party. It is all part of the whole wooing of what we call multicultural communities, particularly here in Ontario.
Is it all about ethnic outreach, Antoinette?
I think it actually makes the process of becoming a new Canadian more difficult, and that the reality, I think, will be that people will find it more challenging. So I'm not sure if that block of voters is going to be that thrilled. Right now, I think it's great on the surface because it is such a strong document compared to what we had. But in the long run, as people actually have to learn it and deal with it, things may be a bit different.
Last 30 seconds to you on that.
Well, I think whoever is learning it now wouldn't know anything about the previous guy, so I don't think that that really is part of the calculation. I think it does represent a very clear set of values, which is different from the previous, but I'm not sure 100% convinced that it will necessarily lead to more votes. But it kind of conveys a certain set of values that was absent before.
Gotcha. I want to thank all of you for coming in and having such a civilized and occasionally energetic discussion about what they've done with the new guide on being a Canadian citizen in this country, starting on the right side of the table. Antoinette Gagné from OISI and Francisco Rico Martinez from the FCJ Refugee Center, Debbie Douglas from OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, and on the other side of the table, Avi Go from the Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, Richard Gwynn, our good friend who we always love seeing back here at TVO. Richard's been a staple on this network for so many years. Thanks so much to you as well, Richard.